Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Sea Otter Awareness Week and our webinar put on by Marine Conservation Institute with the help of Brent Hughes from Sonoma State and Heather Barrett from Sea Otter Savvy. I'm going to give you just a quick introduction and then we will pass it on to Heather and then Brent will jump in for the webinar. I know you all, first off, probably think this is all about sea otters, but fun fact, we're all actually not sea slugs, banana slugs. All of us having attended UC Santa Cruz on our path to you this afternoon. My name is Lance Morgan. I am president of Marine Conservation Institute. Our mission is to secure strong permanent protection for the ocean's most important places, and really to see wildlife recover. As you might guess at this point, that includes not just protecting places, but a conversation about what reintroduction, recovery, rewilding actually looks like. So I am really thrilled to have Heather and Brent join me today to actually talk a little bit more about what this looks like with regard to sea otters. And you're in for a real treat because Brent is really at the front edge of all of this research, and Heather's done a lot of field work with otters and has a lot to add to our webinar this afternoon as well. So we're going to go through a few presentations. When Brent is done, we're going to accept Q&A. Feel free to use the Q&A feature on the webinar and ask questions, and I'll moderate the last 15 or so minutes of the session. I'd like to remind you, if you are interested in supporting the work of Marine Conservation Institute to bring you webinars like this and stay engaged and be advocates for sea otters, please, use one of the links to support us. You can also go to our website, marine-conservation.org. So with that, I would like to introduce Heather just a little bit more. Heather is originally did her undergraduate degree at UC Santa Cruz and then did field work for otters in the Elkhorn Slough area and has been the communications science director for Sea Otter Savvy and is really at the core of driving a lot of this work about the conversation of what comes next. And so with that, Heather, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lance. Yeah, let me just quickly share a screen so I can share some material with you guys. So, my name is Heather Barrett. I'm a sea otter biologist and I'm the science communication director for Sea Otter Savvy. First of all, thank you guys all for joining us. It's our 4th day of Sea Otter Awareness Week, and a big shout out to the Marine Conservation Institute for hosting this presentation. Thank you guys. I wanted to give you a little bit of background for those that might not know. Sea Otter Awareness Week happens every year during the last week of September, and it's organized in partnership with Sea Otter Savvy, Defenders of Wildlife, and California State Parks. And you can find the full list of this year's events on the Defenders official Sea Otter Awareness Week calendar. We do have a few days left. There are a few more things to go check out, so don't miss it. And each year, we actually have a different theme to emphasize what's new in sea otter research and conservation. And so this year's theme is ecosystem mosaic, and it follows the idea that the sea otter's ecosystem is a mosaic. It's made up of tiny parts that if you remove one of those key elements, it can change and damage that system structure and ultimately render the ecological picture incomplete. So here with the final logo, you can see that all the pieces are in place and form a healthy ecosystem. But I also want you guys to note that this event marks the 4th of our We Were Here Sea Otter event for the week. Now, Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program is dedicated to educating communities and stakeholders that are missing sea otters. So the southern sea otters range is currently a little north of Año Nuevo to about Gaviota State Park in the south. But sea otters historically were found all the way along the Pacific coast, and they are ecologically as well as culturally significant. And right now there's an increase in discussion around range expansion as well as the possibility for reintroduction. But to move forward, government agencies and the sea otter research community really needs to gauge public stakeholders' opinions. So sea otters, like other fish and wildlife populations in the US, they are held in public trust. And what that means is that the government manages and protects these resources to benefit the public, which is you guys watching. So therefore, all of your voices and opinions, they matter. And ultimately, the public is going to decide what happens with the fate of sea otters. And we want to hear from your perspectives, and whether that be support or concern regarding sea otter reintroduction. So if at the end of this presentation, you are wondering what you can personally do, please take the stakeholder survey if you haven't already. If you have, because you've been watching all of our Sea Otter Awareness Week stuff, please share it with others, family, friends, colleagues. And I want you guys to note that this applies to those of you that are not in California. So if you're out of state, this applies to you, as well as those that are out of the country. We would like to hear from all of you. The links for the website and the survey will be made available to you right now in the chat, as well as later, and they're going to be posted with this video when on YouTube. But now I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Brent Hughes is a professor at Sonoma State University, and his interests focus on processes that affect the stability of coastal ecosystems. His research centers around coastal habitats with foundation species such as seagrass, salt marsh, and kelp, all of which provide valuable ecosystem services, but are threatened by human activities. Now, in previous research in Elkhorn Slough, Dr. Hughes discovered surprising connection between sea otters and eelgrass that really changed our fundamental understanding of sea otter ecology in estuaries. His work has also looked at sea otter species recovery in past historical habitats, and how this can be a lesson for science and conservation efforts, and as well collaborated with research focusing on the potential risks for sea otters if reintroduced into San Francisco Bay. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Hughes join us today as one of our We Were Here Sea Otter speakers, and I'm excited to learn more about how new ecological paradigms can inform on the recovery of sea otters in Northern California. So thank you guys, and I'm so excited. Brent, take it away.
Okay, hey, thanks Heather, and thanks Lance in the Marine Conservation Institute for hosting me and during Sea Otter Awareness Week. And that photo that Heather was just showing, it's me at a really happy time. I was pretending to be a sea otter in that picture, hence all the digging and the clams. That was quite fun. And now my lab goes out and kind of repeats these kinds of surveys of clams just by pretending to be sea otters digging in the mud. So it is kind of fun to be out there. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I think everybody can see that. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that the research presented here was conducted on First Peoples traditional lands and waters in North America. I am grateful to the Coast Miwok of Great Rancheria, the Ohlone, the Obispeno, Chumash, the Coast Salish, the Tlingit, and Haida for the privilege of working in their ancestral territories. So I'm going to be talking a lot about sea otter conservation in this talk here. I think this picture does a lot of justice to and sets the stage a little bit for what I'm going to present to you. This is a sea otter crossing the road in Elkhorn Slough. It's actually moving from one salt marsh to another salt marsh. And you know, we don't typically think of sea otters as salt marsh animals, but this animal was moving from actually a somewhat brackish salt marsh to more of a marine salt marsh in the Elkhorn Slough. And now, because sea otters are using these unique habitats, it's kind of forced us to put up, you know, sea otter crossing signs and speed bumps in Elkhorn Slough so we don't hit these animals. So sea otter conservation, you know, where did science start getting it wrong? And so, you know, it hasn't been the perfect story so far in the plight of the sea otter. And we can actually pinpoint where we started getting it wrong to this one photo that had an accompanying article in Life magazine in 1938. The extinct sea otter swims back to life. And in this article, they actually call it, this is a raft, they called it a herd of sea otters. And there's about 50 of these animals. And this is the coast of Big Sur, kind of pretty close to Bixby Bridge, you know, the famous bridge that goes over that canyon there in Big Sur. And when you think about Big Sur, a lot of it, you know, some of us might have had the opportunity to travel to Big Sur. And, you know, what we know about Big Sur, even to today, it's treacherous. It can be difficult to get there. Oftentimes the roads have completely collapsed into the sea. And so it's just a kind of a harsh place. And if you go back to, you know, think back to the 1930s or the early 20th century, and you know, you're a remnant population of sea otters, well, Big Sur would probably be a good place to be, right? It's pretty treacherous for humans to get there, but either by boat or by land. So this remnant colony was found off the coast of Big Sur. And because of that, it kind of changed what our perceptions, or molded our perceptions of what sea otters are and what their habitats are. And, you know, this all has a cause to it. And the cause is the overhunting of sea otters. Sea otters, if you've ever touched a sea otter pelt, I've had the opportunity to do it. It is probably the softest thing you will ever touch. Some of us might be aware of these cool little facts about sea otters, like they have 1 million hair follicles per square inch, which is kind of fun, but it kind of makes sense when you touch it. And so these were highly prized pelts. And European hunters, primarily Russian and Spanish, overhunted them in nearly, it pretty much took them less than a century to hunt almost all the animals. And the story is kind of ugly too, because they would recruit, or actually enforce, enslaved Aleut hunters, such as what you see here, who are these expert native hunters from Alaska. And they would bring them all the way down to California to hunt sea otters in around California. And so here's a map that I think it just came out from a report by Bodkin, Estes, and Tinker for the Alaka Alliance, which they're putting together a feasibility study, or I guess they've already done it, to look at, you know, what a relocation of sea otters to the Oregon coast might look like. And so they made this nice map here. And you can see where the remnant colonies were. You know, around that time, Life magazine published their picture of the herd of sea otters. There were still remnant colonies, but they're, you know, in these kind of far off places, right? Around the Aleutians, Southeast Alaska, and then that one spot in California, Big Sur, which is, we know, kind of this treacherous place to be. And so they were like predation refugia for the sea otters. Historically, there was about 300,000 of them. And by the 1900s, early 1900s, the low was about 2,000 scattered around these red stars that you see here. And then there's been some translocated populations, and there's been some successful translocations, specifically to British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. There's been others that haven't worked out so well. And part of the reason might be because we don't really have, at that time, a full understanding of sea otter biology and ecology. So currently, you know, some of these efforts have succeeded, and we're about almost a half of what the historic population of sea otters once was. Again, just to emphasize the ruggedness of Big Sur, this was taken at Soberani's Point in Big Sur, and this picture to the lower right kind of just does justice to, you know, what kind of environment those sea otters that were remaining were found in. Very wave swept, very exposed, just a treacherous place. So these remnant colonies, where were they found? Well, they were mostly found around outer shore rocky reefs. And so our earliest studies of sea otters really focused heavily on these rocky reef communities, specifically kelp forest communities. And now we have one of our most cherished paradigms in science and ecology was because of these original studies, primarily by Jim Estes. And, you know, we now have this beautiful paradigm, a simple paradigm where sea otters can remove sea urchins, and that by removing the sea urchins, these herbivores, they can actually free the kelp from this strong herbivory pressure on them. And that results in what we call a trophic cascade, where you get more kelp in these areas with sea otters. So if we fast forward to, about 10 years ago, I'm doing my PhD. There's me, a little bit younger me, and you can see by my face that I've been spending a lot of time with a wetsuit around my head that summer. And that's Elkhorn Slough. I'm in the harbor of Moss Landing. And I started out my career as a marine botanist. I really had no interest whatsoever in sea otters. I was interested in things like algae and seagrasses and salt marshes. These were the things that really got me jazzed. And when I started my PhD, I was working in an estuary, Elkhorn Slough, which is the local estuary in Monterey Bay, right? Sits right in the heart of Monterey Bay. And surrounding it is a bunch of agricultural land. And a lot of the water, the runoff from these agricultural fields brings a lot of fertilizer and nutrients into the estuary. It's one of the most polluted estuaries, nutrient-wise, on the entire planet. And so, but it has seagrass. And what we knew about seagrass and what we still know about seagrass is very sensitive to enrichment of nutrients in the system. And it's not because it's sensitive to the nitrogen itself, it's sensitive to the little algal epiphytes that are stimulated by the nutrients that grow on the seagrass. And it can be so harmful that it can actually shade out the seagrass, and then you can get a collapse of seagrass meadows. And that's what we were seeing in Elkhorn Slough for a certain period of time. And then there was resilience. And that period of resilience, when the seagrass was coming back, really kind of fascinated me as a marine botanist. And so that's kind of where the story started. When looking at resilience, I was looking at many factors, primarily oceanographic and environmental factors that could be driving seagrass resilience. And nothing seemed to really fit toward, these temporal dynamics that we were seeing in the recovery of seagrass until I started looking at sea otters. And until then, sea otters were just these animals that kind of got in my way when I was trying to do my seagrass research. And then, so what I noticed about the seagrass in Elkhorn Slough is that, and here's a picture of typical seagrass meadow in Elkhorn Slough on a good visibility day, which is kind of rare. But this was a good visibility day. And you'll notice how lush and green the grass is, right? There's not a whole lot covering it. And this is really important. This is an important indicator of a healthy seagrass ecosystem. And that's what we saw. And it was very surprising until we started looking at the sea otters. And when I say we, this is me and all the colleagues that I work with, which I'll give a shout out to at the end of the talk. But what we ended up finding is that it's not so much urchins, like in the kelp forest, that are the important kind of keys and maybe this trophic linkage between sea otters and seagrass. And there's a couple of other levels involved in it. So it's a little more complex. But so in this system, Elkhorn Slough, there's really no urchins at all. But the crab, like Dungeness crab, cancer crabs, these are the main prey items of sea otters. And almost anywhere you go and you find sea otters and crabs intermixing, sea otters tend to eat those crabs. And so in the Elkhorn Slough, what we saw there was such a reduction in crabs that it allowed these little grazers that you see here, these are the images. The green sea slugs are sea hares. And in fact, if you look over my left shoulder, that's a nice picture of a sea hare right there with some eggs crawling around the seagrass. And these animals are amazing. They're like little lawnmowers, and they go up and down seagrass all day long. They don't eat the seagrass, they just eat the epiphytes. And so they're just these tremendous animals. And then there are also these other invertebrates in the system, isopods, that can also be these really important epiphyte herbivores. And so by removing their crab predator, it allowed it allows them to flourish in Elkhorn Slough. And we get now healthy seagrass, and it's recovering, and it's almost back to its historical state, which is really exciting. So we've, been really interested, we being, these seagrass, sea otter colleagues, marine ecologists up and down the coast about, is this a generalizable pattern? Is this example of sea otters influencing seagrass limited to just Elkhorn Slough? And so what we've been doing is we've been surveying other places. And a couple summers ago, a bunch of us got together and we sampled seagrass in areas without sea otters and areas close by with sea otters. And we did that across much of the range of sea otters from Southeast Alaska all the way to Central California and points in between. So this was 9 institutions. And so we used standardized sampling techniques to see, well, what are the patterns? And I won't go into specific details, but what we're seeing is that if you're in the north or in the south, that eelgrass biomass, and this is total eelgrass biomass on the y-axis, you have a significantly greater amount of eelgrass per unit area in areas with sea otters. And in the south, it's very dramatic. It's almost 3-fold increase in seagrass biomass. So this is part of my first graduate student ever, Joe Jackson. This is actually part of his thesis. Joe's about to finish his thesis next month, and hopefully the publication will come out soon after that. So as we're following around sea otters in Elkhorn Slough, we started noticing that they were using these habitats that we had never seen them use, and in fact, science has never seen them use. And so there was really no record of sea otters using salt marsh habitats prior to us observing them in Elkhorn Slough. And this is the scientific history, right? I'm not talking about the ancestral history, the traditional history. But for our most recent scientific history, it was quite surprising. And they were not only using these salt marshes to haul out on, we thought they were just using them to haul out and rest because they don't have to deal with the cold water anymore. But it's also they're eating the crabs that are in the salt marshes, that are burrowing into the salt marshes. And that kind of launched a whole new line of research. And again, we're focused on this one system, Elkhorn Slough, which is literally, or has been until recently, eroding away. The salt marsh has been eroding away. On that left picture, you will see what a typical salt marsh looks, or used to look like, I should say. It's riddled with holes, right? And those crabs are digging and burrowing into the holes. They actually eat the roots of the salt marsh because they have so much sugary goodness to them. So they're really nutrient-rich energy sources for the crabs. And then, they destabilize the banks. And so we have other forces like sea level rise. And in the Elkhorn Slough, there's a tidal prism that keeps growing because of sea level rise in the artificial opening of the mouth of the estuary at Moss Landing Harbor. And so the crab just kind of compound these physical forces, and what you get is what on the right, you get slumping or calving of the marsh. And once that goes, once that marsh goes away, it's not coming back because of sea level rise and the law, really a lack of sediments coming into the system. So my other graduate student, Madeline Sanchez, who just finished her thesis, she started looking at these sea otters and utilizing new technology to monitor sea otters, which is very unique in that we're using camera traps. And so what's cool about camera traps is we can set out camera traps and go away. And the sea otter doesn't need to see us. We don't need to see them. We don't need to bother them. We don't need to disturb them. And we have 24-hour surveillance on the sea otter. And then what Madeline has developed are these machine learning algorithms that can you can train a computer to scroll through all this video that you're obtaining so you don't have to sit around and watch video. And it will give you outputs based on what it sees. And you have to train the computer, the machine, to identify sea otters. And you do that by feeding it images, which is really easy to do. There's a million sea otter photos on the web. So then you can couple this with the ecology of the system. So she looked at, well, what happens with, when crab densities change or crab abundance change in these salt marsh areas. And then using machine learning, you can start identifying individual behaviors too. And so she looked at, well, is there any correlation between crabs and sea otters? And what she found is that as crab abundance goes up, foraging frequency of sea otters goes up. So there's this really kind of strong effect that we're seeing of sea otters on the crabs in the marsh, which are these kind of harmful, we consider them kind of harmful because they can erode it away. And there's a picture of Madeline right there. So what we're doing now is we're looking at, well, in using tidal creeks. So Elkhorn Slough is just a network of tidal creeks. So we can use these tidal creeks as their own individual replicates. And based on observations that have been done over the last couple of decades from the aquarium, USGS, we can actually start modeling that. And this is what our colleague Tim Tinker does, and say, okay, we can actually put a value of how many thousands of shore crab are consumed at each one of these tidal creeks per year. And the more consumption by sea otters of these crabs, the actual erosion starts going down. So marsh edge retreat, it's just looking at, from an aerial view, how far the marsh is widening, or that creek is widening. So the more widening, the more erosion and the more loss of salt marsh. And so you want very low edge retreat. That signifies low erosion. So more otters means more consumption of crabs, which means less erosion in the system. And then we can put temporal signatures to this. So we have annual surveys of sea otters that have been done since they entered the estuary in 1984. And then we have great aerial data that we can convert into annual erosion rates because of all these aerial surveys that have been done by the Department of Agriculture over that region. And so they've been flying over Elkhorn Slough since the 30s. And so we can put that together and we can start looking at this temporally. So what you're seeing is on the top, all the sea otters in Elkhorn Slough from 1983 to, this starts at like 2015, but the population overall in Elkhorn Slough is basically flatlined. We think it's reached carrying capacity in the last few years. But if you follow erosion, so here, 1950 is a really important date. That's around the time they opened up the new mouth to the estuary, the artificial mouth, which caused much more transport of marine water and flushing of the estuary that started. That's when we think erosion really started ramping up. And it did until around the 1990s when the sea otter population in Elkhorn Slough started exploding. And so we can see that here, that the increase in sea otter density corresponded with a decrease in erosion. The sea otter population in the late 90s, early 2000s crashed in Elkhorn Slough and regionally. And that coincided with a really sharp increase in erosion in the system. And then since then, the sea otters have been expanding and recovering. And now they have the highest concentration of sea otters in the state of California. And we can see erosion has gone down to almost what it was in the 1930s. So, not everything that sea otters do can be positive, right, from a human lens. And, when we think about sea otter recovery or reintroductions, a big concern is, what are they going to eat? How much of it are they going to eat? And is it going to affect us? And so a recent graduate student from San Diego State who I worked with, Tracy Grimes, did a phenomenal study looking at how sea otters impact Dungeness crab nurseries. So what we know about Dungeness crab is that they use estuaries as juveniles. And it's because it offers in certain situations, a predation refugia, maybe not in this case, but it also allows for ample prey that allows them to kind of grow to, at a rapid rate to get to a size. And then once they reach a certain size, they leave the estuary for deeper waters. And so what Tracy did is she looked at eelgrass, which is in green here. And then she looked at unvegetated areas like mudflats or sandflats. And then she looked at how sea otter density influences Dungeness crab size. And what she found was that it really has no impact if they're in eelgrass. And that kind of makes sense because seagrass can be somewhat of a refugia. But it's really when they become really exposed in these unvegetated mudflats that the more sea otters you get, the smaller the crabs get. And it's not because they're decreasing in size, it's just that they're selecting for the larger crabs. So there seems to be somewhat of an effect to what we call the nursery function, which is the ability of these juveniles to survive and grow to adult stage. And so, but it seems to be, this negative effect seems to be limited to mudflats. However, the good news is when we look at the fishery, and so this is what Tracy did next, was she looked at all the crab fisheries. So these are the major landing ports for Dungeness crab in California. The green are the ones that currently are within the range that doesn't have sea otters, like Northern California. And then the two orange ones, the yes ones, are Monterey and Morro Bay. So those regions do have Dungeness crab. And as sea otters have been increasing in their densities over the last 2 decades, so 2000s to present, the landings of crab have actually gone up, which is encouraging. It really means that sea otters aren't having an impact on Dungeness crab. So we take that as a good news. And there's Tracy right there, showing us her survival skills, I guess. And so what can, I've shown kind of what sea otters do to these systems, but what can these systems, namely estuaries, do for the sea otter? And what we think is that they can be these really kind of oases, these really important oases when things go bad in the outer coast. Especially if we focus on predation, predation being a big one in both the northern region with killer whales and down here with great white sharks. In both regions, what we think is limiting the sea otters and their expansion, or in the case of Alaska, their decline, are these larger predators. And so if we look at Adak Island in Alaska, this is around the Aleutian Islands, there's been recently a big crash in sea otters. But there's this really large lagoon, shallow water lagoon that's just loaded with seagrass, has one of the biggest seagrass meadows in the world, Clam Lagoon. Its sea otter populations seem to actually be doing pretty good during this period of decline, indicating an oasis. Central California, we know that the population of sea otters is basically plateaued. We're at carrying capacity. But in that same time, the elkhorn slough population, for some reason, just keeps expanding. And I think I've demonstrated pretty well why it's expanding. They're utilizing these habitats that we had no idea they could actually use. So are we starting to get it right? I hope so. Every time we follow these sea otters around, they seem to show us new stuff, and they can become surprising. They're going towards brackish water marshes. So I don't know what's next for the sea otter, but I think we're starting to get it right in terms of, what's the true breadth of habitats of the sea otter, where are the good prey sources? And when we think about reintroductions, where would you actually put a sea otter or a group of sea otters? And so we're starting to look at that, right? We're starting to think forward to places like San Francisco Bay and trying to imagine what it would look like with sea otters and how many sea otters it could support. And so now that we have several studies looking at sea otter growth rates over time across a variety of habitats, estuarine habitats, we can actually start modeling this. And so here's just a habitat map of San Francisco Bay. You have the greens and the browns, which are the eelgrass and the salt marsh. So again, our colleague Tim Tinker, who does these great population modeling exercises, And it's done one for San Francisco Bay, and the estimate that is about 6,000 sea otters San Francisco Bay could potentially support. But San Francisco Bay has all these challenges to it, right? There's a lot of boat traffic, and there's a lot of pollution and all these other things going on. So, you know, we're also looking at other systems that don't have all that human influence, especially places around Point Reyes like Drake's Estero. We've been looking at that estuary very specifically because we think it would be great. There's almost no human influence. There's plenty of habitat. And as you can see from this right-hand graph, this is edible crab biomass caught in these traps that you see me with. Drake's Estero has some of the most prey items that we see along this coast. So there can be other areas, and we're developing the models that will predict how much some of these smaller estuaries like Drake's and Tamales could potentially support. And then if we think even further, you know, these estuaries along Northern California can be these really important hotspots for sea otter recovery, but it also could potentially seed the outer coast populations, which could have a huge benefit to ecological catastrophe that's happening right in front of our eyes with the loss of kelp forests in the Northern California coast. And these have been associated with an increase in urchins and urchin barrens. And there's a lot of potential for sea otters as restoration tools for bringing back kelp. Okay, that's it. But these kinds of sea otter studies where you have all these trophic levels and you know, botanists and geologists and sea otter biologists, you know, you can't do this alone. It takes a huge team to do this, and I'm so lucky to be working with all the people that you see here. So I'd like to thank you all in these different organizations, and I'd like just to, if Jim Mestes is listening, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, just to get well, Jim, and take the survey.
All right, great. As we kind of make the transition here, thanks so much, Brent. That was super informative and a lot of great research you've done over the years. I'd like to encourage everyone to put your questions into the question and answer box, and feel free to, you know, share any thoughts as well. I'll do a little bit of moderating. One of the things that maybe you could expand on a little bit just to get us going is it sounds like sea otters might be unsung climate heroes, you know, with all this positive impact on both seagrass and salt marsh. I wonder, you know, have you given any thought to that, or are people studying that idea?
I've given a lot of thought to that recently because I've had like a lot of reporters asking me this question.
Oh, okay, great.
I've been thinking about it a lot. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where we're at, like this neat point where we can actually start thinking about these really broad questions about the role sea otters play and you know, potentially mitigating climate effects. And I think it's really exciting. And I think there's just a ton of, I think we're at just the beginning of it. And there's so much more work that can be done along those realms. And, you know, not just sea otters, but, you know, other animals that might have these similar type of effects. Primarily promoting vegetation, which sea otters seem to be promoting vegetation across the board, which is super cool.
Yeah, well, I know from my, you know, purview in this, the blue carbon, which is, you know, the carbon associated with oceans and especially salt marshes and seagrasses is very much all the buzz these days. So I'm not surprised that the media has been asking you about it. But I was really impressed with the fact that they helped stabilize the banks, as we say, sea level rise, which is really, I knew the crabs undermined it, but that was a really interesting aspect of it as well, and really intriguing. So one other follow on to that, you know, the North Bay here, obviously we've been breaking the dikes and restoring tidal flow to these areas. And with that, have you seen, I mean, it seems like they're down the road as an opportunity, but is that system starting to refunction? Do you know how that's doing in terms of?
You know what? I think the big restoration around the North Bay and the wetlands, San Pablo Bay, I think it's been quite successful. I mean, it's still like under, you know, it's still developing, right? It wasn't too long that they actually did that restoration. And I've only heard kind of positive things happening through that. And I think a lot of it is just maintaining or restoring that natural hydrology of the system, right? And those salt marshes are so good at maintaining that. And so I think anything that's going to help kind of restore that natural kind of hydrologic flow in a system is going to be all good, but be it humans or sea otters or, you know, whatever.
Right.
Yeah, you know, I think we're realizing that it's those kind of natural features are really important for sustaining an ecosystem, like a marshal wetland. Yeah.
Right. A similar question came in from one of the viewers asking about how does the drought affect the salt marsh? And
yeah, you know, that's a great question, and this is something I think about all the time when I'm out in these salt marshes, and you kind of look at them in, you know, August or September, you're like, oh, you're looking like you're just dried up and about to just fall and like blow away. And there's been big studies in the southeast of the United States that have shown major impacts to drought and how marshes recede during drought conditions. And in fact, in the southeast, it makes them the marshes are more susceptible to fungal pathogens, and then they're more susceptible to snail herbivory. And it can be really bad. So we know from southeast salt marshes that can be bad. I feel like it could be bad up here just from my observations, but I haven't really looked at that, you know, from a data perspective, which is more observational. They just look stressed when it's been, you know, the last few years of drought. They just look bad.
Yeah, great. So we have a question about predators of sea otters, which you explored a little bit. I have a kind of a twist on that one, which is we've seen very few otters kind of pass the shark triangle from Año Nuevo to the Farallones to, you know, Bodega. And so do you think that's had an impact, or why do you think the Golden Gate has been such a barrier for otters moving northward? I know we see singletons all the time here and there, but.
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think the evidence points to the great white sharks, you know, as far as I can tell. I don't know. One thing that hasn't been explored too much is habitat connectivity. So how close are these important sea otter habitats to each other? And I feel so like that could be a really informative study for sea otter, especially the applied aspects, the conservation aspects of sea otters. You know, are there, you know, along that coast, you know, there's a lot of beach, right? And then there's a big estuary, and then there's, you know, all these roving predators. And so I think it probably also has to do with how far away these important habitats are to each other, be it kelp forests or seagrasses or salt marshes. That should be explored as well.
Right. So maybe we can have you stop sharing your screen for a moment, and didn't realize that, but get Heather back up here as well for a moment. Because I think one of the next questions actually might be one for Heather, which is somebody's asking about the timing of reintroduction. But I know it's not quite there yet, but maybe you can speak to the idea of, you know, what does the process kind of look like? You know, when we're going to see an otter here again in Sonoma Creek, or if you can't answer that, you know, maybe you can explain a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely happy to talk a little bit about what that process is sort of looking like. Timing right now, there isn't necessarily a timeline for that. And at this point, there aren't necessarily, my understanding is in those that are discussing recovery plans aren't willing to discuss specific locations yet either. We're really at the stage of are we comfortable having this discussion? And we need stakeholders to join that discussion. I think historically, when there's been reintroductions, there's always been a bit of a conflict. And I think that what we want with this is for the community to come together, because it's really a community issue, and sea otters are part of that community and could potentially be a part of that community. So we want to make sure that all the different stakeholder groups, whether it be general public, the fisheries, indigenous groups, are coming to the table and everyone gets to discuss that. So that's the stage we're at right now. And I know that with the agencies, they're really looking to hear from all of you guys. And I do know that there is a plan to put some information in around December, but at this point, there is not a specific timeline. And if I could always find out a little bit more, but that's what I think I'm able to answer for that one.
Right. Yeah, no, that's great. And so, whether it's the San Francisco Bay or it's elsewhere in California, there's not really it's a process at this point. It's not really a done deal or anything really moving.
But it's exciting that it's a process. I mean, the fact that the discussion's happening means that people are serious about it. And so I will say this, it's a serious discussion and it's looking very hopeful. And so again, that push, everyone needs to come to the table, share your input, even if you have concerns. So we're looking for those that are other stakeholder groups that maybe are a little worried about this conversation. We want to hear from them too.
Right. Another question we have is there competition between sea otters and river otters? Where there's, river otter colonies that maybe, have been threatened in the past as well.
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts on that.
I would love to hear Brent's thoughts on that.
Because I for a time, I was kind of investigating river otters, and the unique thing about them is that there would be overlap in terms of habitats and prey. We know that river otters can behave almost like sea otters. But when it comes down to their flexibility or their adaptability, the river otters, they can move on to other habitats. They can go upland, they can go to creeks, they can go to ponds, eat crayfish, eat mussels. Somewhere else, they can also eat fish. They're excellent fishers, the river otter, whereas the sea otter is not a good fisher. And so my thought is that, and then the river otter is about a third the size of the sea otter. So if they come together, I think the river otter is gonna have to go probably somewhere else, hopefully nearby. But I don't, if it was I don't think the sea otter, I don't think would necessarily eat a river otter, but I think it would outcompete it for sure.
Right. Okay. I have another question that I was just thinking of. I've sometimes seen these horror film type video clips of mitten crabs, marching up the delta, and they get into the water system, and it's just, thousands of these guys climbing all over it. Would sea otters have any impact on that? And would otters actually move far enough up the delta? How far up the delta do you think they could actually?
I mean, I've thought about that, and it's like, well, as long as there's prey, they could. I don't know what their limit is, because now we see them in brackish marshes. And one thing I didn't show here is that they love eating European green crab, which is also a really horrible invader. In fact, in Elkhorn Slough, these areas with sea otters, we don't catch green crab anymore because I've seen them just have a nice smorgasbord with green crab. So I don't know. I guess it would depend on I'm not too familiar with the size of the Asian mitten crab. So size will be a factor. Like these marsh crabs, they eat are like about this size. So the crabs from the marsh. So, they'll eat smaller crabs and smaller prey items, but so it would depend on the amount of calories they're getting from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got kind of a tough question on management of otters that popped in, which is, if otters were to get really abundant in an area where they caused conflicts, do you know anything about how they've been managed in the past? Or I know in the Channel Islands for years, one of my fish and game colleagues was always the guy they called to come remove the otter that ended up in the wrong spot. And that was his whole life's work. But, can you fill us in on anything there about how that, that might be a part of this process?
Heather, did you want to answer? Or do you want me to
I mean, if you have thoughts, Brent, definitely
I have
jump in. I
thoughts.
feel like this would be more of a Lillian question. I wish she was here.
Yeah, I
That
know. I
one.
just really too. I do have some thoughts, and I didn't really mention it too much. But you know, if we talk about traditional communities, the Native Americans, they've been managing sea otters for a very long time, for thousands of years, and they've doing it very successfully for thousands of years. And you know that does involve a little bit of hunting, which is an awful word in California, but you know, but it's a way of coexistence. And right. A lot of, you know, we don't have the fortunate geography that they have in Alaska, where, you know, you can hunt the otters in the interior passages, right? And that they use the outer coast. So it's, in terms of the management, it would be great to learn a little bit more from Native communities from here. We know a lot from Alaska and British Columbia and Washington, but it's the geography is a lot different. So I'd be wanting to know how they have done it in the past too.
Right. No, that's such a good point. And it's definitely, I would love to know that as well. And I would say for the person asking the question, it's an excellent question. And it's actually one that is sort of addressed in the survey. And we asked that a little specifically. So we'd love your thoughts on that, because that is the question that would immediately go back to those that are discussing recovery plans. I know it's in their best interest to have that information, and they are looking to see what they can do around management, because it's not just going to be plopping sea otters down and letting them go. There's going to be a lot of details around that.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate that this is where a lot of the controversy will lie. You know, of course, Native Americans, otters, abalones, and urchins did all coexist. There's lots of evidence in the middens that, you know, they were eating, or at least, you know, hunting otters as well as urchins and abalones, and all of those things were quite abundant up until the time otters were removed. And now we get to these kelp forests today in which, you know, we have recently seen this heat wave die off, which isn't probably, it's probably more of a climate regime scenario than actually a change in the ecological paradigm. But I wonder, you know, Brent, maybe what thoughts you have on the role of possibly having a healthier, you know, coast kelp forest.
Yeah, you know, so it's interesting with the kelp, you know, and I agree, it's a climate thing. Like, we're now in an El Nino period, and we're seeing recovery of the kelp, even without the sea otters and without the sunflower stars, the big, which Heather has in her mosaic, sunflower star, and that, you know, those are the major predators that we've lost. And so, but you know, you know, I think the important role that otters or sea stars will play is the mitigation of these heat waves that are just going to keep on coming. You know, we're going to have our nice La Nina cycles where things get cold and we feel like we're back to normal. We're kind of like getting all excited right now here on the North Coast about the recovery of the kelp, but we have to realize that, you know, a heat wave is just around the corner. So, you know, what can we do about that as a long-term strategy? And, you know, sea otters seem like a really good strategy. They're way more efficient at removing urchins than humans, I can tell you that. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to say thank you again very much to both of you, Brent and Heather, for joining us for this webinar. Heather, I want to give you the final word, both on Sea Otter Awareness Week and your survey. So go ahead and remind everybody how they can be part of that, and you know, feel free to share web links and get into the chat for everyone.
Well, I just want to say thank you guys all for coming for this. Sea Otter Awareness Week is such a special week to so many people, but I also think that it's important that we're reaching out to new stakeholder groups. So we're looking to be able to have more conversations around fisheries and that difficult question that was asked last. I think that that's really important, and we want to have that discussion. So if there is concerns, we want to know them. And that's how we can move forward, because ultimately the goal is coexistence. So I greatly appreciate Marine Conservation Institute hosting. Thank you so much, Brent, for being our headliner for this. And my plug is, please share your voice. It matters. And if you think you're not a stakeholder, you're wrong. You are. So go take the survey.
Yeah, and I will say that, you know, we aren't fortunate enough right now to view otters here in San Francisco Bay, but boy, Elkhorn Slough is just a golden opportunity to go see sea otters, and very easily. So I really encourage you all to get down there and get in a kayak and respect the nap, of course. But you know, it's a wonderful opportunity, and you know, it's again wonderful to be with you guys today. I really appreciate everybody tuning in, taking an hour out of your evening to be part of this with us, and I wish you all well. Please stay in touch and, you know, provide us any feedback through Marine Conservation Institute or Sea Otter Savvy about what's going on, and we'll look forward to the next round of research updates this time next year. So yeah, with that, I'll say goodbye. Any last words? Anybody want to throw a last thought out there?
We're good. Yeah.
All right. And I want to thank my team for all the behind the scenes that they did to make this look like it went off pretty smoothly. So thanks, you guys. All right. Everyone have a great night.
Bye.
Thanks so much.